The subject this morning is making peace. It would be an understatement to say that we are living in challenging times. Of course, life in this world is always challenging. The world seems difficult because we're in it and we have to deal with it. And in today's world, we are faced with conflicts. We're faced with wars in Ukraine and other places. We are faced with conflicting ideas and opinions of our fellow citizens, and at times we're faced with strife within our own families. And television and social media bring all sorts of conflicts into our consciousness, and then we have to react to them. And our tendency in that reaction is to take one side or another, causing the conflicts that exist around us to become conflicts within us. Conflict is never a good thing, but people can grow through it. War brings out the worst in some people who see it as an opportunity to vent their personal cruelty or hatred. But war also brings out the best in some people, people who find the opportunity to serve others by helping or protecting them. In a war, many people, whether they're military or civilian, are willing to lay down their lives for their friends. Some people see it as an excuse to do harm. Others see it as an opportunity to defend and protect. During a war, whether a person is a soldier or a civilian, one has to ask and answer a similar question. Do I slip deeper and deeper into the spheres that are flooding out of hell in the conflict, or will I use the opportunity to overcome those hellish spheres and take the opportunity to serve my neighbor? Of course, those of us in this cathedral, or many of those listening at home, are not at war. We are blessed with peace as far as the country is concerned. But there's a teaching in the book, Divine Providence, that gives us pause for thought. We read, there are lesser wars and greater wars. Lesser wars between property owners and their neighbors, and greater ones between the rulers of nations and their neighbors. And the only difference between the lesser and the greater ones is that the lesser ones are limited by national laws and the greater ones by international laws. There's also the fact that in both cases, the participants want to violate the laws, and that the lesser ones cannot, but the greater ones can, though still not beyond the bounds of possibility. So at some point, we find ourselves in a state of conflict. And the question that we have to ask then is, how can we use conflict in our lives to grow? As individuals, we have considerably less influence over the development of the greater wars, as the doctrine describes them. But we have a great deal of influence in our own behavior in the lesser wars that are part of our daily lives. And even in these lesser wars, in the conflicts that we experience as individuals, we have to face the same questions as a soldier in a greater war. Do I use my personal conflict as an excuse to vent my negative feelings, or do I overcome them and seek to serve my neighbor? The Lord addresses this subject 3 times in the Gospel of Matthew. The first that we're going to work with this morning is a very familiar passage on how to deal with others who are in conflict with us. And this is given to us in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 18. Moreover, if your brother trespasses against you, go and tell him about his fault between you and him alone. If he shall hear you, you have gained a brother. But if he will not hear you, then take with you 1 or 2 more, that in the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses every word may be established. And if he shall neglect to hear them, then tell it to the church. But if he neglect to hear the church, let him be unto you as a heathen man and as a publican. So in these verses in the gospel, the Lord lays out a process of how to deal with someone who has done something, who has trespassed against us in some way. In this scenario, we are the person who has been wronged. And reconciliation really rests on the willingness of the other person to be reconciled to us. When a person is willing, it is a simple matter. One goes and has a discussion of what has transpired. And if the person hears us, the transgression can be repaired, and the person in the wrong admits that they were wrong and is willing to make peace. But the Lord also acknowledges that not everyone is willing to make peace or amends and repair relationships. People dig in their heels, especially when they think that they are right and the other person is wrong. And this adds to the fuel to the fire of a conflict, making it much harder to resolve. And so the Lord laid out the steps to follow as the conflict intensifies. Discuss again with witnesses who hear both sides of the story. And if this intervention does not work, take the final step to take the conflict to the church to find a solution and forgiveness in the presence of the Lord. If such a person still then refuses to be reconciled to remedy the wrong done, then there's very little else that we can do. While it's important that we wish the person well and hope for the best for them and maybe hope for eventual reconciliation, for the sake of peace, it may be best to steer clear of them. So following the Lord's teachings in this sequence in the Gospel of Matthew can be challenging. It's often hard to confront people with their trespasses. But if we do that, if we try those things, at the end of the exercise, whether we are reconciled with our neighbor or not, we might still have a sense of satisfaction saying, well, I've done everything that I can, and leave it at that. But the question arises is, have we done everything that we can? In our perception of a conflict, it's often much easier to find the other person at fault. And at times it can be very pleasant to tell them what their faults are, even though that feeling of pleasantness might not come from heaven. The obvious danger of dealing or focusing on another person's transgressions is that it deflects our minds away from our own complicity in the conflict. Conflicts are seldom one-sided. By definition, a conflict is a battle or a strife between two people or two groups of people. And it's easy in that conflict to ignore our part and to exaggerate the other person's contribution. And this leads us to the consideration of a second passage in the Gospel of Matthew, which the Lord spoke towards the end of the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 7. Imagine the people gathered around him on the mount and the Lord preaching, and towards the end of his sermon, he says, "Why do you behold the mote that is in your brother's eye, but do not consider the beam that is in your own eye? Or how will you say to your brother, 'Let me pull that mote out of your eye,' and behold, a beam is in your own eye? You hypocrite, first cast out the beam from your own eye, and then you shall see clearly to cast out the mote out of your brother's eye." Here the Lord is telling us that if we don't pay attention to our role and our contribution to a conflict, we may overlook important factors in it. The Lord's command to cast the beam out of our own eye is timeless. And we all have beams in our eyes. These beams are our personal issues, our attitudes, our habits, our ways of acting, and the list is endless. But there are things about ourselves that we are often completely blind to. We think that they're just part of us. It's our nature, it's our character, it's the way I am or who I am, the definition of our lives by ourselves. And over time, these attitudes and habits and actions might become so ingrained in us that we no longer even see them, let alone see them as obstacles in our relationship with other people. And so with that in mind, we then turn to the third of the subjects or the passages given to us by the Lord. And again, this is in the Sermon on the Mount, but much earlier in the Sermon on the Mount, a portion of chapter 5 in the Gospel of Matthew. And in this teaching, the Lord speaks to us of the importance of self-examination. He says, "Therefore, if you bring your gift to the altar, and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go your way, and first be reconciled to your brother, and then come and offer your gift. So we might ask ourselves, well, what are the gifts that we bring to the Lord's altar? In some ways, if we had been one of the people sitting on the mount at the Lord's feet, we would have thought of the gifts in terms of the sacrifices offered by the ancient Jews when they came into the temple and took their sacrificial animal to the altar and laid it before them. But we don't do that. We come into worship in cathedrals and churches, and we don't have a sense necessarily of laying a gift before the Lord. And yet, in both cases, whether we were an ancient Jew or who we are today, both times we're coming to worship the Lord. It's the external ritual that is different, not the internal that lies within us. So we can look at the motions of ritual and the motions of external worship. And if we see those simply as motions, as something that we do, then they become merely matters of the body. The Lord looks at us, however, in our internals. He looks beyond just what we do with the body. In our lesson, we were told that motions are simply motions. We can be like automatons, but it's the will that counts within it. It's why we do those motions. And that will lives within us. And so we're told that the Lord looks at our internals. He looks at the motives in our worship. And so when we come to worship the Lord, we bring our gift to lay before the altar. He sees the whole of us coming before him. And one thing he might notice in us is whether we have done harm or offended some person who has not done any harm to us. When we do that, we might give that person a reason to bear a grievance against us. A person may want to retaliate. We raise that person into a state where they might be led to put aside their charitable thoughts and feelings that they might otherwise have and start leading them in ways that they don't want to go or shouldn't go. And so we become, in that situation, the person who should be spoken to. We become the person who needs to be reconciled to the person we have wronged. We become the person who is confronted by the witnesses and taken to the church. And if we don't reconcile, we become as a heathen to the person we have wronged. So it's not unusual for us in the course of our lives to do things that other people can hold against us. Most of us are in process. We're spiritual works in process, and we have things in our makeup that need to be removed or reordered, put aside. And maybe this is why the Lord spoke those words in the Sermon on the Mount. He had finished at that point explaining the fifth commandment, you shall not kill. Now, this is a very familiar teaching to us. We shall not kill. But the Lord explains in that sermon more than simply killing of the physical body. In the Sermon on the Mount, he describes killing as our mental attitudes, our feelings, expressed in the actions that cause conflict with other people. And the difference between this teaching and the Lord's command to speak to someone who has trespassed is that this time we are the ones who have trespassed. Most of us don't kill people in a physical sense. But killing involves many things that might not be physical, things that are much more common in the course of our lives. Anger at another person for some reason that exists in our own minds and leads us to commit unprovoked attacks on another person. We can kill another person by harming their reputation through gossip or accusation. We can harm others by making them appear foolish in front of other people so that their standing in society is diminished. And in each of the cases the Lord describes, the person's ability to function in this world is greatly reduced. In that part of the Sermon on the Mount, the Lord is giving us a much more subtle view of what killing involves. And yet there are times when we might feel very justified in doing or saying these things. And it might be difficult for us to see those in our lives because we frequently make up excuses to excuse or justify our anger, to justify the things that we say or do. And when conflict ensues as a result of that, it becomes easy to blame the other person as the source of our anger. So conflict is never good, but conflict can be useful when it leads to good, when it leads to growth. And so the Lord told the crowd who gathered on the mountain to hear him preach to reconcile to those that they have injured in some way. He's telling us to be reconciled to people that we might have injured. And we can only do this in steps. First, it's important for us to see and acknowledge that at times we are not the victims, but we're the perpetrators, we're the cause of conflict around us. The second is to reflect on the effect of what we say and do to others. And the final step is to reconcile with the person. And that word reconcile is very interesting because it's only used once in the entire New Testament. It's translated variously as reconcile, make friends, make peace, reestablish a relationship with another person. And that's what the Lord is telling us to do. But making peace is not always an easy thing to do. It requires us to have an honest introspection and an evaluation of ourselves. It requires us to have a willingness to let go of the things in us that cause the problem. It requires humility if we are going to apologize to the person for the things that we have said and done, or what we have, or how we have done things. And so if reconciliation is to be real, it needs to come from within us and reach out to other people. Now, you might have noticed that in looking at these three passages from the Gospel of Matthew, I've worked backwards through the Gospel, starting with the passage in chapter 18 about how to deal with conflict by talking to one's neighbor, bringing witnesses, going to the church, and so on. Then we went further into, or backwards in the Gospel to chapter 7, where we read about the Lord's teaching that if we're going to resolve conflict, we need to remove the beam that is in our eyes so that we can see clearly, to remove the mote in our brother's eye. And then finally in chapter 5, we were told to look inside ourselves to see what we have done to cause another person harm. And so we began with conflict outside of ourselves and gradually moved to conflict within ourselves. It's not always possible for us in this world to effect a reconciliation with someone who has caused us harm in some way, who's trespassed against us. They might not be willing to look inside themselves and go through those steps of evaluating themselves and being willing to be reconciled. They might not be willing to remove the beam from their eye. They might not be willing to lay their gift at the altar and go and be reconciled. So we don't always have the ability to be reconciled with other people. But what we do have is the ability to make ourselves be willing to be reconciled. That means we need to look at ourselves. We're the people that we have control over. We look at ourselves and we see, what have I done? What have I done to harm or hurt another person? So what would happen if we reversed the order of those three passages that we read? And if we approached them in the order that the Lord actually gave them, then we would have something like this, that we would approach the Lord's altar. We would come into the worship of the Lord, bringing our gift, bringing our life, because our gift to the Lord is the life that we live, bringing that gift. And then as we come to worship the Lord with our life in mind, see through our reflection that we have harmed someone, to then go out and repair to the best of our ability that harm that we've done, to make peace with the person. By doing that, we are following the Lord's command. And once we have done that, and we have no barrier within us, then our life will be in such a form that we will actually be in true worship of the Lord. And so we can come back to the altar and offer our gift. But the other two follow from that. It becomes very difficult for us to reconcile with other people if we focus on the beam that is in our own, the mote that is in their eye, and ignore the beam that is in our eye. Self-evaluation and self-examination of what we say and do and how we do it requires us to look at ourselves, our attitudes, our habits, our beliefs, our behavior. The list goes on and on and on. What do we do and how do we do it? And when we see those things and we're willing to correct them so that we can come and lay our gift on the altar, then it makes it possible for us to get rid of that beam and then work to help our neighbor remove the mote from his eye. And how does that happen? That takes us to our third passage. One goes to the person and discusses with the person, seeks reconciliation, as we were told in Matthew 17. So the Lord gives us some very inspiring teachings in His Word of how we can resolve conflicts in our lives. We need to bear in mind that these are the lesser wars that are described in the book Divine Providence. These are the wars between people. And those are the wars that we can have some degree of control over, at least our part of that war. A soldier, we are told, is a person who loves peace and loves tranquility. He goes to war and he fights the battle because it's necessary. But once the battle is finished, then the war is finished and the man or the soldier embraces peace once again. And that is where we are in our lives. When we are in conflict, sometimes we have to work through that conflict. But if we're looking for peace, then we will find that peace by following the teachings that the Lord gives us. And eventually, we will be able to experience what the psalmist said in Psalm 133. Behold, how good and how pleasant it is for brethren to dwell together. Amen.